You have 10 minutes to leave the property. That was what HOA President Meredith Voss told me, while two bulldozers idled behind her at the entrance to my 5,200-acre family farm. A sheriff's deputy stood beside her. So did Gavin Rourke, the developer who had spent 3 years trying to buy the land from me. This time, Gavin was holding a recorded warranty deed with my name at the bottom. According to that document, I had sold him everything 6 weeks earlier. The cattle fields, the farmhouse, and the barn where my father had taught me to work with my hands. Meredith tapped my signature with one polished fingernail. "You signed it, Mr. Mercer. This property belongs to us now." The signature looked exactly like mine. But the notary seal beside it belonged to a woman who had been dead for 8 months. So I didn't yell. I didn't touch the bulldozers. I photographed every page, turned around, and walked back toward the farmhouse. Because beneath the floorboards of my father's old office was one original deed Meredith had never seen. That deed didn't just prove the farm was mine. It proved Meredith and 26 of her partners had pledged their own homes against land they had never owned. Deputy Lucas Grant shifted uneasily when Meredith called me a trespasser. I had known Lucas since he was a teenager. His father used to repair fences along the south pasture, and Lucas had hunted deer on the farm with my permission. Now he stood between me and my own gate, one hand resting near his belt. "Caleb," he said quietly, "they have a recorded deed. I can't decide ownership out here. Until a judge reviews it, I need everyone to stay calm and keep away from the equipment." Behind him, orange survey flags ran straight through my cattle field. Someone had already painted demolition marks across the doors of the old equipment barn. Gavin watched me study them. "You should have accepted my first offer," he said. "You could have walked away rich." "I never accepted any offer." Meredith raised the document again. "Your signature says otherwise." I asked Lucas for 5 minutes to photograph every page. Meredith objected, but the deed was supposedly a public record. She couldn't explain why I shouldn't be allowed to see it. The parcel description covered all 5,200 acres. The sale price was listed as $8.4 million. My signature appeared above a notary seal, clean enough to fool almost anyone. Then I noticed the recording number. The first 4 digits belonged to a filing series the county had stopped using 3 years earlier. I handed the document back without mentioning it. Meredith smiled, convinced I had finally understood that I had lost. But someone had made a mistake long before those bulldozers reached my gate. And the dead notary wasn't the only person who had left records behind. I spent the next hour at my kitchen table comparing the forged deed with every document I had signed in the past 5 years. The slant of the letters was right. So was the sharp hook at the end of my last name. Then I found the source. 3 years earlier, I had signed an emergency access agreement allowing the county fire department to cross the eastern pasture during wildfire season. Someone had scanned that signature, removed the original background, and placed the image above a fake notary block. They hadn't imitated my handwriting. They had copied it. The deed also claimed that an $8.4 million payment had been deposited into my account. My bank records showed nothing. No wire transfer, no check, not even a failed transaction. At noon, Meredith sent me an email. I had 72 hours to remove my cattle, tools, vehicles, and personal belongings. Anything left behind would become the developer's property. At the bottom, she had written, "Your refusal to cooperate will not reverse a completed legal sale." I forwarded everything to Sarah Bell, a property attorney I had known since my surveying days. She called 10 minutes later. "Don't tell Meredith about the dead notary," she said, "and don't mention the recording number." "Why not?" "Because right now, she thinks the forgery worked. Let her keep thinking that." Sarah paused. Then she asked the question I had been trying not to think about. "Caleb, do you still have the original deed?" I looked down the hallway toward my father's locked office. "I know where he hid it," My great-grandfather bought the first section of Mercer land in 1912 after spending 12 years working on railroad crews across 3 states. By the time my father inherited it, the farm had grown to 5,200 acres of pasture, timber, creek beds, and wheat fields. He placed the property inside the Mercer Family Land Trust. The trust allowed the farm to pass from one generation to the next, but the entire property could not be sold without written approval from every named trustee. My father had done that deliberately. Developers had been circling the land ever since Silver Ridge Estates opened along our northern boundary. They saw golf courses, luxury cabins, and hundreds of Lakeview homes. My father saw the fields where his parents had survived the Depression. Before he died, he made me promise that no amount of financial pressure would divide the property. Meredith assumed I was nothing more than a struggling cattle farmer in muddy boots. What she didn't know was that I had spent 17 years working as a county land surveyor before returning to the farm full-time. I had helped map the original Silver Ridge development, and I still had copies of my field notebooks. That night, I opened one of them and compared the HOA parcel numbers with the legal description in the forged deed. Several numbers didn't describe my farm. They described the land beneath the oldest section of Silver Ridge itself. The residents owned their houses, but according to my notes, someone else still owned the ground beneath 27 of those properties. By sunrise, Meredith had turned the forged sale into a public campaign. The HOA newsletter described me as a former owner refusing to vacate development property. A county code inspector arrived before breakfast after receiving complaints about my barns, fuel tank, and cattle pens. He photographed everything as though he were documenting a crime scene. Then my feed supplier called. My operating credit line had been frozen because a lien had appeared against the farmhouse. That was when the pressure became real. I could sleep in my truck if I had to. My cattle couldn't wait for lawyers to spend 6 months arguing over paperwork. Sarah met me at the county records office. Together we pulled the lien, the deed, and every filing connected to Rourke Development. The lien claimed that I had defaulted on obligations created by the sale, but the filing date was wrong. It had been recorded 2 days before the document claiming I had sold the farm. Sarah placed both papers side by side. They prepared the punishment before they completed the forgery, she said. That afternoon, Gavin's attorney delivered a final notice. I had 72 hours to leave. If construction was delayed, they intended to hold me responsible for millions of dollars in lost revenue. Meredith called 20 minutes later. "You can still walk away quietly," she said, "or the whole community can watch the sheriff remove you." I looked through the farmhouse window toward my father's office. She thought the deadline was closing around me. In reality, it had finally forced me to open the one place my father had told me never to touch unless the farm itself was in danger. My father's office had been locked since the week he died. The room still smelled faintly of cedar, machine oil, and the pipe tobacco he was never supposed to smoke indoors. His desk sat beneath the same window where he had balanced farm accounts for 40 years. I moved the chair, lifted the old rug, and found a floorboard with a small brass screw near one corner. Underneath was a fireproof metal box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay the original 1912 warranty deed, every amendment to the family trust, and a thick agreement labeled Master Ground Lease, 1986. Sarah arrived before I finished reading. The original deed carried the county's embossed seal and a handwritten legal description that matched the boundaries in my field notebooks. The chain of title showed no sale, transfer, or authorization to Rourke Development. Then Sarah opened the ground lease. Decades earlier, my father had allowed the first Silver Ridge developer to build part of the neighborhood on Mercer land. The residents could own their houses, but the ground beneath a specific group of properties remained inside the family trust. Near the back of the agreement was a clause dealing with fraud and default. If the lessee falsely claimed ownership, attempted to transfer land it did not possess, or pledged that land as collateral, the trust could demand repayment and ask a court to foreclose on the assets securing the agreement. Sarah read the clause twice. "The fake deed doesn't give you their homes," she said. I looked at the list attached to the final page. "No," I said. "But it proves they used those homes to guarantee the fraud." Sarah spent the next morning tracing every amendment attached to the ground lease. The original developers were long gone, but the guarantees tied to the lease had never disappeared. When Meredith and Gavin refinanced the expansion project, they renewed those guarantees under a new corporate structure. 27 residential properties were listed as security. They included 6 model homes owned by Rourke Development, several investment properties belonging to HOA board members, and Meredith's mansion overlooking the northern pasture. "They signed the new guarantees 18 months ago," Sarah said. "They pledged these properties to support the development loan. And the bank approved the loan using my farm as collateral, using the forged deed as proof they owned it. That distinction mattered. The original deed did not allow me to walk into Silver Ridge and start selling houses. It proved that the development loan rested on property obtained through fraud. If the court voided the forged transfer, the loan could fall into immediate default. And if the court awarded damages, an independent receiver could sell the properties the conspirators had voluntarily pledged. I pointed to the homes belonging to ordinary residents. What happens to them? Nothing, unless they signed a guarantee or participated in the fraud. Then we protect them. Sarah looked at me for a moment. Meredith had tried to take every acre my family owned, but I had no intention of punishing families who had never seen the paperwork. We filed for an emergency injunction that afternoon. At 4:17, a judge ordered the bulldozers off my farm and froze every new land transfer connected to the project. But the order came too late to stop one thing. Meredith had already accepted deposits on 146 future homes, each one promised on land she had never owned. County Recorder Helen Cho met us in a records room beneath the courthouse. She had already checked the filing number from the forged deed. It belonged to an abandoned document series that hadn't been used in 3 years. Then she pulled the electronic access log. Someone had entered the records office after closing using the credentials of a clerk who was on vacation. Security footage showed Gavin's attorney walking into the building with a leather folder under his arm. But the strongest evidence was the notary seal. The deed claimed that Helen Price had watched me sign the sale 6 weeks earlier. Helen Price had died 8 months before that date. Her official journal contained no entry under my name, and the serial number on the forged seal had been copied from a public filing she completed years earlier. That eliminated any argument that the document contained an innocent mistake. It had been manufactured. The sheriff's department opened a criminal fraud investigation that same afternoon. Then Helen showed us the payment records attached to the filing. The $8.4 million the deed claimed I had received had never been sent to me. It had moved from Rourke Development into a consulting company registered to Meredith's sister. From there, nearly $2 million had been transferred into an account Meredith controlled. Sarah placed the bank records beside the death certificate. They copied your signature, used a dead woman's seal, and paid themselves for your farm. Before we left, my phone rang. It was Meredith. "You should have taken the deal," she said. "Now I'm going to make sure you lose everything." She still had no idea the sheriff was standing beside me, listening to every word. By the next morning, Meredith knew the investigation had reached her accounts. She called an emergency board meeting and blamed everything on Gavin's attorney. According to her, the HOA had been misled by outside professionals. Then Celeste Brooks, the HOA treasurer, received an order to delete 3 years of financial records. Celeste did the opposite. She copied the ledgers, emails, loan guarantees, and special assessment statements onto a flash drive. Before she could bring it to us, Meredith accused her of embezzlement and removed her access to the HOA office. That night, someone cut the chain on my eastern gate. A trail camera captured 2 men entering the farmhouse in uniforms belonging to Silver Ridge Security. They searched my father's office but left empty-handed. The original deed was already inside Sarah's evidence vault. The break-in gave the sheriff enough cause to seize the HOA security logs. Those records showed that Meredith had personally authorized the visit under the label Document Recovery. Celeste met us the following morning in the back room of a roadside diner. Her hands shook as she pushed the flash drive across the table. "They're going to blame all of this on me," she said. Sarah opened the first folder. Inside were internal projections showing that Meredith had never intended to stop with my farm. Once the development loan closed, she planned to mortgage the clubhouse, the private roads, and nearly every HOA-controlled asset. Celeste looked directly at me. "Your land wasn't the end of the plan," she said. "It was the money she needed to take control of the entire neighborhood." The injunction stopped construction, but Meredith refused to cancel the public launch of Silver Ridge Grand Reserve. She had already invited investors, county officials, local reporters, and nearly every HOA resident. Canceling the event would look like an admission that the project was collapsing. So she doubled down. A temporary stage was built on HOA land beside my northern pasture. Behind it stood a polished sign showing golf villas, a private lake, and 600 future homes spread across my farm. Sarah told me not to interfere. "Let her speak," she said. "Every public lie becomes evidence." The sheriff placed plainclothes investigators among the crowd. Celeste stood near the back with a copy of the financial ledger hidden inside her coat. I brought only one thing, the original deed. Meredith stepped onto the stage wearing a white suit and the same confident smile she had worn at my gate. She told the crowd that I was a desperate farmer trying to escape a lawful sale. Then she raised the forged deed and claimed that she had personally watched me sign it. Gavin stood beside her, nodding. Several residents looked at me as though I were the criminal. Sarah waited until Meredith finished. Then she walked toward the stage and placed one old document on the table beside the microphone. "Mrs. Voss," she said, "you told everyone that you witnessed Mr. Mercer sign this sale." "I did." Sarah opened a second folder. "And did the notary witness it too?" Meredith's smile disappeared. Because Sarah was holding the notary's death certificate. The crowd went silent as Sarah placed the death certificate beside the forged deed. Meredith stared at the date. Then she looked toward Gavin. He took one step away from her. Sarah unfolded the original Mercer deed and asked Helen Cho to verify the seal. Helen confirmed that the deed had remained valid through every lawful transfer into the Mercer Family Land Trust. Then came the certified chain of title. There was no sale to the HOA, no authorization to Rourke Development, no valid signature from me anywhere in the county record. Sarah placed my old survey map beside the deed. The proposed resort, all 600 future homes, and the access road Meredith had already advertised were located entirely inside Mercer property. The next document was the 1986 master ground lease. Sarah explained that Meredith, Gavin, and the participating board members had renewed the guarantees when they refinanced the expansion project. They had pledged 27 residential properties as collateral, including Meredith's mansion, board-owned investment homes, and 6 Rourke model houses. Meredith grabbed the microphone. "This is a misunderstanding. Our attorneys handled those documents." Celeste stepped out of the crowd and handed the sheriff the financial ledger. It showed the fake purchase money moving through Meredith's shell company. Helen displayed the security footage of Gavin's attorney entering the records office after closing. Finally, Sarah read one of Meredith's emails aloud. "Once the farmer is gone, no one will challenge the title." Residents began shouting. Reporters pushed closer to the stage. Gavin tried to leave, but two investigators blocked the stairs. The county attorney looked directly at Meredith. "You didn't purchase Mr. Mercer's farm," he said. "You mortgaged your own home against property you never owned." For the first time since she arrived at my gate, Meredith had nothing to say. The sheriff stepped forward. "Meredith Voss, turn around and place your hands behind your back." The criminal case had begun, but the civil judgment was about to cost her far more than her position as HOA president. The forged deed was voided before the end of the week. Once that happened, the development loan collapsed with it. The bank had approved millions of dollars using my farm as collateral. Because Meredith and Gavin had never owned the land, the loan entered fraud default, and every property they had pledged became subject to review. The civil case continued over the following weeks. Sarah presented the original deed, the ground lease, the bank transfers, the forged filing, and the personal guarantees signed by Meredith, Gavin, and the participating board members. Their attorneys argued that selling the pledged properties would harm the community. I agreed, so I asked the court to protect every resident who had not signed a guarantee, received stolen money, or participated in the fraud. Meredith had tried to take 5,200 acres from my family. I wasn't going to become her. The judge appointed an independent receiver to recover the damages. The receiver took control of 6 model homes, several board-owned investment properties, the developer's residential assets, and Meredith's mansion. 3 weeks later, red notices appeared across Silver Ridge. Court-ordered sale. The signs did not appear in front of innocent families. They appeared only on properties the conspirators had voluntarily pledged to finance the scheme. I stood across the road as a notice was attached to Meredith's front gate. She watched from an upstairs window while reporters photographed the house she had once used to impress investors. At the same time, sheriff's deputies removed the Silver Ridge Grand Reserve sign from my northern pasture. The bulldozers were loaded onto trailers. Every orange construction marker was pulled from the ground. Meredith had forged one sale to take my farm. The original deed triggered 27 legal sales to repay what she and her partners had stolen. But when Sarah handed me the final judgment, I asked her one question. What happens to Silver Ridge after the old board is gone? Silver Ridge held its first open board election 6 weeks later. Celeste helped the residents trace every special assessment Meredith had collected, and the court ordered the stolen funds returned wherever possible. The new board published its financial records online and required independent review before any future property agreement could be signed. I could have asked the court to terminate every ground lease. I didn't. The residents who had bought their homes honestly were offered new agreements with fair terms, clear boundaries, and permanent protection from any future board claiming ownership it did not possess. Part of my settlement was used to create a legal fund for farmers and elderly landowners facing title fraud. We also converted my father's unused machinery barn into a training center for surveying, agricultural trades, and property record research. On the first morning after the final bulldozer disappeared, I drove to the northern pasture with a new wooden sign in the back of my truck. Lucas helped me set the posts. Together, we raised it where Meredith's resort advertisement had stood. Mercer Family Farm, EST, 1912. For a moment, I could almost hear my father telling me the left side was an inch too low. Beyond the fence, cattle moved through grass that had once been marked for luxury villas. The farmhouse windows caught the morning sun, including the room where my wife had spent her final winter. A signature can be copied. A title can be forged. And someone holding a clipboard can convince an entire community that your property belongs to them. But real ownership leaves a trail. In deeds, surveys, records, and generations of people who refused to surrender what was theirs. Meredith thought I was quiet because I was weak. I was quiet because every time she lied, I made another copy. The farm stayed in my family, and this time, the truth stayed on the record.